The clock in the dimly lit office ticked away the seconds, each sound echoing like a reminder of how long it had been since I last saw my brother. 15 years. 15 long years since Gene Ray Tucker had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but memories of his dazzling smile and the way he could light up a basketball court like no one else. They called him the Graveslayer because he had a knack for reviving hope, even in the most hopeless of situations. Now I sat at my desk in the precinct, looking over the cold case file for what felt like the millionth time, hoping to find something, anything, I might have missed. As a detective, I knew the odds weren't in my favor, but as a brother, I couldn't let it go. Shonna Kay, my twin sister and fellow detective, knocked lightly before walking in. She wore that determined look, the one that said she wasn't leaving until she got me to take a break or eat something. "You're at it again," she said, glancing down at the open file. "You know staring at that isn't going to bring him back." "I know," I replied, my voice thick with the familiar frustration and grief. "But we're never going to find him if we just let it collect dust." She let out a sigh and sat down in the chair across from me, pushing a coffee cup my way. "Well, you'll be happy to hear that it looks like you're not the only one who hasn't given up. We got something new." My heart skipped a beat. I leaned in closer, anticipation and dread knotting in my stomach. "What kind of something?" "An anonymous tip," she said, producing a crumpled piece of paper from her jacket. "It was left on the front steps of the station late last night. Claims to know what really happened to Gene." I snatched the note from her hand, quickly scanning its contents. The words were hastily written, but the message was clear enough. Gene Ray Tucker didn't just vanish. He was taken. Look deeper into the Graveslayer's enemies. The note reignited a fire in me that had been flickering dangerously low. Gene had enemies, sure, but he was no street thug. He was a star, the pride of our neighborhood, a kid who'd managed to rise above the crime-riddled streets that swallowed so many young lives. But stardom bred resentment, and there were those who envied the light he carried. Shonna and I began retracing Gene's last known steps. The basketball court where he'd played his final game, the corner store he visited daily, the old haunts where he would meet up with friends. We questioned people who had known him, both the familiar faces and those who lurked in the background, always just out of sight. It wasn't long before we hit a lead, a small-time hustler named Dex who claimed to have seen Gene the night he disappeared. We found him loitering in a rundown bar, and though he was reluctant to talk, a couple of beers and a few stern words from Shonna loosened his tongue. "Gene wasn't just some kid with a basketball," Dex said, his eyes darting around nervously. "He was mixed up in something deep. He was meeting people that night, people who didn't belong in our neighborhood." "What kind of people?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Inside, I was a knot of tension. He shrugged. "The kind that got suits too nice for our streets, if you catch my drift." We left the bar with more questions than answers, but it was a start. The mention of people who didn't belong struck a nerve, and my gut told me that Gene's disappearance wasn't just some random act of violence or a deal gone wrong. There was something personal here, something connected to the Tucker name. As we dug deeper, Shonna and I began to uncover a tangled web of connections that linked our family to several powerful figures in the city. It seemed that our father, a respected community leader, had crossed paths with some dangerous individuals years ago. There were whispers of debts owed, of betrayals and vendettas that dated back decades. Our father had always kept us at arm's length when it came to his work in the community, and now I wondered just how much he knew about Gene's fate. When we confronted him, his reaction was guarded, as if he'd been expecting us to ask. "Some doors are better left closed," he said quietly, his eyes heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Gene knew that. He knew what our family was up against. "Then why didn't you tell us?" Shonna demanded. "Why didn't you ever warn us that something like this could happen?" "Because I thought I could protect you," he replied. "I thought I could shield you from the darkness." The more we uncovered, the more I began to feel the weight of secrets buried beneath our family's name. There were files that had gone missing from city records, witnesses who had conveniently died or vanished, and a trail of money that led back to some of the most untouchable figures in the city. The anonymous notes continued to come, taunting us, offering breadcrumbs that we had no choice but to follow. They hinted at a man named Malcolm Graves, a powerful crime boss who had long been rumored to have ties to everything from illegal gambling rings to high-profile disappearances, and every thread seemed to circle back to him. As we closed in on Graves, Shonna and I found ourselves stepping into dangerous territory. Our investigation wasn't just stirring up the past, it was unsettling powerful people who would do anything to keep the truth buried. In the end, it came down to an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, the last place Jean had supposedly been seen. Shonna and I went in, guns drawn and hearts racing. What we found there wasn't Jean, but a clue left behind, a faded jersey with his nickname, the Graveslayer, scrawled across the back in bold letters. It was stained with blood. My chest tightened as I stared at the jersey. It felt like a cruel reminder, as if whoever was behind all this wanted us to know that we were just pawns in a much larger game. The last note we received that day was different. It didn't taunt or offer hints. It was a single sentence that chilled me to the bone. The Graveslayer was never yours to find. As Shonna and I left the warehouse, I realized that finding Jean was no longer just about discovering what had happened to my brother. It was about unraveling a legacy of lies, deceit, and a darkness that had been stalking our family for far too long. And it wasn't going to stop until it swallowed us whole. The chill of the autumn night seeped into my bones as Shonna and I exited the warehouse, leaving behind the blood-stained jersey that once belonged to Jean. We walked in silence back to the car, each step heavier than the last. I could feel the bond between us straining under the weight of our shared grief and the dark secrets we were unearthing. As we climbed into the car, Shonna's voice broke the silence. "You know what this means, right?" she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's been playing us from the start. Someone who knows everything about Jean." I gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "We're not backing down," I replied. "Whoever left that note, whoever's trying to taunt us, they're going to slip up, and when they do, we'll be there." Our next move was to follow up on Malcolm Graves. If the rumors about him were true, he had a hand in everything that went on in this city, from the shadiest back alley deals to the most pristine boardrooms. The problem was getting close enough to find out what he knew. The anonymous tips had helped us piece together a list of names, people who were supposedly connected to Graves and his operations. One name stood out, Terrence T-Bone Collins, a former enforcer who had recently turned his back on Graves' organization. If anyone knew where to find answers, it would be him. Finding T-Bone was easier said than done. He had disappeared off the grid after leaving Graves' organization, which only made us more suspicious. It took us weeks of chasing dead ends, hitting up old contacts, and searching through back channels before we finally got a solid lead. He was hiding out at an old auto shop on the outskirts of the city. When Shonna and I arrived at the auto shop, we found T-Bone hunched over an old car engine, his hands greasy and his expression tense. The moment he saw us, he bolted, but we were ready for it. Shonna cut him off at the exit while I circled around, cornering him. "I don't want no trouble," T-Bone shouted, his eyes wide with fear as we closed in. "I left that life behind." "We're not here to bring you trouble, T-Bone," Shonna said, her tone calm but firm. "We're here to ask you some questions about Malcolm Graves and my brother, Jean Ray Tucker." At the mention of Jean's name, T-Bone's expression changed, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition. "I don't know nothing about your brother," he said quickly, his gaze shifting nervously between us. "I left Graves' crew a long time ago." "Then why do you look like you've just seen a ghost?" I asked, stepping closer. "If you don't know anything, you wouldn't be so scared, would you?" T-Bone swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All I know is that Graves got himself a new right-hand man not long after Jean disappeared. Someone with a killer's instincts and a grudge against anyone who got in his way." Days after our encounter with T-Bone, the cryptic messages started appearing again. This time they were more than just notes. They were taunts, laced with Jean's signature street slang and basketball lingo. Each message seemed to be challenging us, daring us to look deeper. The clues led us from one grim location to the next. Old abandoned buildings, crime scenes that had been long forgotten, and alleyways